Oh yeah, I should do that too. How do I?
Good evening. Welcome to the Henry George School for a special seminar co-organized with Saving Communities. And our speaker of the night is Dr. Dan Sullivan, who is also the director of Saving Communities. I just want to mention that this is part of a series of 4 seminars that we have scheduled. You may want to take a look at the exact dates by checking on our Henry George School website, sgss.org. So Dan Sullivan is a longtime Georgist, and he's been the chairman of the Council of Georgist Organizations for a couple of years. He also is a very good friend of the Henry George School, as he has already taught a couple of classes, including the Science of Political Economy before and after George, and many more. And we hope to be having him on a more regular basis. So tonight's talk is how Henry George got us the secret ballot and how we are losing it. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you. And by us, I mean the United States. I don't know exactly when Canada got it, but France got it first, and Australia got it before we did, and then Belgium and England got it before we did. So what I want to start with is the French Constitution in 1789 called for a secret ballot, and the voter wrote on a slip of paper, but it wasn't really very secret because it was in the open. So in 1794, everybody was given private booths, but you could still, if you wanted your vote to be known, you could write the name of the person you're voting for in such a way that people could tell it was you. And in 1877, they copied what's called the Belgian ballot, and I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. But the next thing is that the England agitated for this with the Chartists, and the Chartists demanded several things. They wanted universal male suffrage, everyone 21 and above, without a property qualification. They wanted the secret ballot. They wanted ministers of parliament to be paid. One of the things that kept poor people, including small landowners, from being an MP was that it distracted from their lives. So they said, you know, a person of modest means should be able to serve and be paid for it. Only the rich would ever want to be an MP because the sacrifice was too much for poor people. They wanted equal constituencies. England had what was called pocket districts, basically, because of the feudal history of England. Someone could have a district with a very small population and they had the same representation as a district with a very large population. And so they wanted to get rid of that. And they wanted annual parliamentary elections. They thought that you couldn't trust Parliament to be, you know, Parliament members to be in office for long periods of time. So those were the things they wanted, but the secret ballot was the thing that pertains to this talk. And what happened is they rioted, and a bunch of them were transported to Australia, and they organized for the secret ballot in Australia and won. So in 1856, Australia got the secret ballot. And this is more of Jeremy Bentham argued for the secret ballot in England, And James Mill, the father of John Stuart Mill, he argued for it to curb the influence of landlords and employers on tenants and workers. This is all, a lot of the quotes I have is from an article called Rock, Paper, Scissors, How We Used to Vote in the New Yorker. And it's good to use that because it's a mainstream source and not particularly biased. And we'll come back to her from time to time. The interesting thing, though, is that James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, argued against the secret ballot. And he said every man's vote should be public for the same reason that votes on the floor of the parliament or of legislature are public. If a congressman or a member of parliament could conceal his vote, we would not expect him to vote. Would we not expect him to vote badly in his own interest and not in ours? The secret vote is by definition a selfish vote. Only if a man votes under the eye and criticism of the public will he put public interest above his own. Now, this is interesting because in the Pennsylvania Constitution, which I'll bring up later, anybody who is required to represent other people is required to vote on the record. So the secret ballot only applies to individual citizens. But in England at the time of John Stuart Mill's writing, and in most states in America, you had to have property to vote. So in a way, the people with property were representing not only themselves, but they were representing their tenants, or they were representing people without property. So John Stuart Mill's argument makes more sense in the context of England in that time period. So, and also in America in that time period. But I mentioned that France eventually adopted the Belgian ballot, and the Belgian ballot is much closer to what we have than the Australian ballot. This is the Belgian ballot. And as you see, the difference between the Belgian ballot and the Australian ballot, things might have changed in Australia, but originally the Australian ballot just listed the candidates. The Belgian ballot not only listed the candidates, but listed what party they were in and gave you the option of voting the straight party ticket. So at the top of that, you see, if you check that circle for Democratic, it automatically votes for everybody on that ballot. And this is apparently a ballot in Iowa, because there's a Dubuque Street and a Iowa Avenue and stuff, Burlington Street. So I think it's an Iowa ballot, 1893 it says, but this is what's called the Belgian ballot. So if we actually have the Belgian ballot, why do we call it the Australian ballot? Well, it's because Henry George had visited Australia fairly early in his life, and actually married an Australian, Anne Fox. And this is Henry George and Anne Fox in their younger days. I think she looks more stately, and he certainly does. And this is the only picture I found of them together. And it's not in any of the Georgist archives. It was in a wiki tree, which traced family trees or something. But I think she looks like a really solid backup to Henry George's career as a reformer. But anyhow, this is back to Jill Lepore and her New Yorker article again. She said, the most zealous American champion of the Australian ballot, Henry George, first advocated the ballot in December 1871, a few months after the New York Times began publishing its investigation into the gross corruption of elections in New York City under the party boss, William McGeer Tweed. In 1868, a presidential election year, Tweed's amply rewarded repeaters cast more than 50,000 illegal votes. Without the Australian ballot, George wrote, we might almost think of soberly of the propriety of putting up our offices at auction. So nobody at that time had the secret ballot in the United States of any kind. And George constantly, when George championed it, he called it the Australian ballot, and it became very much identified with George. He wrote another thing called Money in Elections, which is on my website, savingcommunities.org/docs, DOCS. And if you scroll down to Henry George, you should get the article Money in Elections. And that's pretty much, he wrote another one called Bribery in Elections. So these were both after the 1871 article, but before he ran for office. So when he ran for office, he was campaigning for the secret ballot, as well as for land value tax, and as well as for getting rid of corruption and everything. And Henry George basically had everybody, he had made enemies of everyone. He had made enemies of the railroads. He had made enemies of Western Union. Western Union controlled Associated Press, so he was an enemy of Associated Press. He was an enemy of the corrupt democratic machine. He was an enemy of the corporate, some things never change. The Republican Party is still the party of big corporations, and the Democratic Party is still the party of corrupt bureaucracy. And that's basically what Henry George saw them as well. And he was campaigning against all of these when he ran for mayor, for mayor of New York. And after the election, when he came in second, basically, there were ballot boxes floating down the East River. That wasn't the first time that happened. That happened in 1851 too, in New York City. So when we talk about how they cheated Henry George out of the election, this wasn't a new thing for the Tweed ring. The Tweed ring is the most notoriously corrupt political ring in the history of US politics. And whether it's actually the most corrupt, it's the most famously corrupt. And they regularly cheated people on elections. And Henry George argued that the way to get rid of that was the secret ballot. So after the election, this was the Saturday after the election, he wrote 68, or he said in a speech at Cooper Union, said 68,000 votes. That is their astonishment that under such circumstances, 68,000 votes could be recorded by what they call green men, without money, without patronage, without the promise of office, with volunteer workers, without the press. Victory. It is a most glorious victory, for it has in it the promise not merely of success, but of that triumph at which we aim. It is coming, thank God it is coming. We have done what we started to do. We have made the beginning. We have brought a great principle into American politics. And men, if you and I die before we can do any more, that is work enough. But he went on to say, every honest man of all parties ought to join in the movement to secure that great reform which will enable the will of the people to be expressed, to secure that we have only to take a very simple system which originated in Australia and now obtains in Great Britain and Ireland. That system is simply this. Instead of individuals printing millions of ballots as here, the name of every candidate is printed on a ballot. The voter goes up to the polls and receives from the election officers a ballot containing the names of all the candidates. He then goes into a compartment where he is absolutely secure from observation and makes a mark across opposite the name of his choice. Now, I should mention that the way they voted in that time was that every candidate had to have his own ballot printed. So if you wanted to vote for Henry George and the United Labor Party, the United Labor Party had to print up thousands of ballots and had to have people there to hand you a ballot if you wanted to go in. And as all the ballots looked different, everybody could see what kind of ballot you were taking into the polls. And there were incidents, this is also in that New York Times article, there were incidents where people got beat up on the way to the polls. One person was beat up, him and his brother were beat up and his brother died. And the court still upheld the thing, saying a man of ordinary firmness would have gotten to the polls anyhow. So they had a very different view of voting rights in those days. But this is Henry George advocating for the secret ballot. And this was 1886. Nobody had it. He hands the ballot to the proper officer and sees that it is deposited in the ballot box. If the voter cannot read, there is a sworn officer present who makes the mark for him. You cannot bribe a man who gets no ticket from you. You cannot intimidate him when you cannot tell how he is going to vote. All this thing of printing ballots and peddling tickets is done away with. That is a reform we ought to have. In the next place, instead of appointing our inspectors as they are now appointed, they ought to be chosen from lists of reputable citizens, just as our juries are chosen. I had never heard of that before, and I think it's an interesting idea. Right now, we elect them. In Pennsylvania, we elect them. So you can go in and vote for yourself and you'll probably win. And if nobody goes in and votes for themselves, then they appoint somebody. But there is no random choosing of electors like there is for juries. And they pay decently. It's like $50 or something for a day. It's not great money, but it's not bad for sitting at the polls on election day. And candidates bring you pizza. Poll workers, you can feed poll workers. You cannot feed voters legally in Pennsylvania. But that was his, that was important enough that it was center stage on his, I guess it's a concession speech, but he thought of it as a great victory. And he, when he was running for office, they said, you can't win. He said, well, I don't want to do that job anyhow. They said, you can't win. All you'll do is raise hell. And he said, I don't want that job of being mayor, but I do want to raise hell. So in a way, maybe it was a victory for him, whether he got the office or not. This was in 1887, I think. Yeah, this was in the Standard of 1887. He said, the new party has, of course, great difficulties to contend with. If the Australian system of voting were now in force in the States, so that each voter would be presented with one ballot and bribery and intimidation prevented, it would be a comparatively easy thing for us to carry the state. As it is, it would require a very large sum of money and an organization which this year it will be impossible for us to effect, to ensure that those who are willing to vote with us are provided with a ticket to vote. So this is, again, arguing for the secret ballot. This was a year later in 1887. The United Labor Party had a, well, let me, because he goes on, oh no, this seems to be a continuation of the previous one. But he goes on and says, in Elmira, the home of Governor Hill, it is said that the people there is said by the people there to be a particularly rotten place politically. $5, $10, $15, and $20 being sometimes paid for votes. At a recent election, two candidates for alderman are said to have bid against each other for a vote until they ran it up to $30. So, and this is, again, this is in that same article in the Standard. In the smaller places too, the intimidation of employees by their employers is more easy than in a larger city. As illustrating how high-handed corporation agents are, a lawyer in one of the towns I visited told me he had recently brought a civil suit on behalf of a railroad employee against a merchant who was a large patron of the railroad. The case would unquestionably have gone in his favor, but before it came to trial, he was visited by a railroad official who asked him to inform his client that he had the option either of withdrawing the suit or losing his employment. Rather than lose his employment, the man consented to withdrawal of the suit. So this is kind of the way politics were like in the age of this is what the word being railroaded really applied to. It calls up the vision of a train coming down the tracks and you better just get out of the way. But it really referred to legislators being so bamboozled by the power of government subsidized railroads that they just acquiesced. So the United Labor Party platform in 1787 and 1788, they're very similar. This is the 1788 one. It says, we especially and emphatically declare for what is known as the Australian system of voting, in order that the effectual secrecy of the ballot and the relief of candidates for public office from the heavy expenses now imposed upon them may prevent bribery and intimidation, do away with practical discrimination in favor of the rich and unscrupulous, and lessen the pernicious influence of money in politics. We still have money in politics, but it's a little less extreme when you can at least vote in secret. Now, all of the media ridiculed Henry George. And in a couple of weeks, I'll get into that on the Henry George versus the media monopoly is going to be at the end of the month on another Friday, I think. And they all were against him. And Abram Hewitt, who was I think he was Columbia professor. He was asked to run because they didn't think that the political hacks in the Tweed Ring could beat him. And Abram Hewitt called him compared him to communists and talked about the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror and all these things. And all the media lined up. So Henry George was just basically assassinated by the media. And part of that is that the media was controlled by the railroads and by Western Union, because you couldn't get news without Western Union. Western Union had a monopoly on communication. So nobody wanted to stand up to Western Union, and they all attacked him and they all attacked all of his ideas. But once the election was over and there was no chance that a challenge would be mounted or anything, the media began to come around to the idea that the secret ballot wasn't such a bad idea. And this is a Puck cartoon. You see the one whip says coercion. They're going to the ballot box, and you see the guy on the left has, I can't read what's in his pocket. It might be eviction or something. And the guy on the right with the whip, his ticket says discharge. So you either vote the way they want you to vote, or you can be fired or evicted, was the point of this cartoon. And this was a Puck cartoon. Puck was horrendously harshly critical of Henry George during his election. But when the election was over, they basically started to agree with him about the secret ballot. And Henry George we had single tax clubs and United Labor Party clubs in cities all over the country, one of which was in Louisville, Kentucky. And Louisville, Kentucky, 2 years later, became the first, this is according to the New Yorker again, the first, now they voted viva voice, which means live voice. In Louisville, you voted by showing up and shouting "I" for each candidate, and the loudest shouters got it. And if there was a question, then they took a count. But they got we won the secret ballot first in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm sure the state legislature had to sign off on it, and they did it as an experiment in Louisville rather than statewide. And it was, according to an observer, the first municipal election which was not bought outright. So so that started instilling confidence. And 2 years later, or not 2 years later, that same year, 1888, the state of Massachusetts put in the secret ballot statewide. And within 10 years, 39 of the 45 states were voting by secret ballot. And now they all vote by secret ballot, more or less. And we're sliding away from that in some ways. And this is just from Wikipedia, but it seems to be accurate, that the 4 essentials of the secret ballot is, first of all, it's an official ballot being printed at public expense. The names of all the nominated candidates and all parties and all proposals appear. So if there's a referendum, it is printed on there. It is distributed only at the polling place, and it is marked in secret. So those are the essentials. And the first 2 are still in place, but the distributed only at the polling place is undermined because we now have mail-in ballots. And because we have mail-in ballots, they're not necessarily marked in secret. And the secrecy, even in the polling places, the secrecy of the modern voting machines is not nearly as rigorous as the secrecy of the older ballot booths and the older mechanical voting machines. When I voted before we had the electronic machines, I went into the mechanical voting machine, and the curtain closed behind me. And then I did all my lever pulling, and I could vote straight party ticket. And I could also pull down the straight party ticket label, and it would pull down all the other levers. It was the big mechanical thing, and it had to be really well machined and well oiled to do that. But I pulled a straight party ticket, and it would pull, if I pulled Democrat, it would mark all the Democrats. And then if there was a Democrat I didn't want, I could manually say, but not this guy. And I could go over to the Republican or Libertarian or Green or whatever and pick an alternative. But the secrecy is being eroded just by the fact, there are all kinds of scandals about machines being riggable, but the first thing is that the voting booths are not nearly as secret as they used to be. And the thing that they only be distributed at the polling place, that does not apply to absentee ballots. And the Pennsylvania Constitution is very specific on who can get an absentee ballot. So this is Section 14, absentee voting. And it's Article 7 is elections in Section 14. So the criteria are that the person can get an absentee ballot if he will, and he has to swear an affidavit to this to apply for the ballot. He can say that he will be absent from the municipality of of his residence. They can get it because their duties, occupation, or business require them to be elsewhere. They can get it because of illness or physical disability, which means they just can't get to the polls. And they can get it because election day falls on a religious holiday, or if they have election day duties. So in Pennsylvania, it would be county employees who are required to work on election day in order to make sure nothing, there's a lot of need for county employees, so that you might have some other county job, but you're expected to work on election day. And therefore, you might not be able to get to vote yourself because you're working the entire period on the election day. So those are the criteria for getting an absentee ballot. And that criteria is to reduce the problems of voter fraud, because mail-in voting is susceptible to voter fraud. The problems with mail-in voting is that secrecy is not guaranteed. You know, you don't have the option of not being secret with the Australian ballot. You have to go in and mark it in private. You have to bring it out. You're not allowed to show it to anybody. It drops in the ballot box. So the secrecy is guaranteed, not just for the protection of the voter, but to protect the candidates from having, voters being bribed. And that was always undermined to a degree. I was a committee man. I was a Democratic Party committee man. And we were in a patronage ward. We had lots of government employees in the ward I represented. And I was not one. I defeated the ward chairman, who was patronage. And people would come out and they'd say to the not to me, but to the government employee right next to me, he'd go in and he'd come out and say, "Write in, write out." And what that means is he pulled the straight party ticket. It takes a long time to vote for everybody individually, but if you vote for the straight party ticket, you can go in, pull it, walk right out. So they basically were revealing that they voted for the straight party ticket in order to curry the favor of whoever was watching them. So the secrecy was not completely guaranteed anyhow, and that's because we were using the Belgian ballot, not the Australian ballot. And ballot harvesting is a problem, and it's illegal in most states. Ballot harvesting is going around and collecting absentee ballots from people. And one of the reasons it's illegal is you can be standing over the voter watching him vote, and if he votes for the guy you don't like, his ballot can get lost. The same thing happens with voter registration, which is also illegal. Now, people will set up a booth to register people to vote, and if the voter registration is by one particular party, they can lose the registrations of people of the other party, which is illegal, and there's serious fines for it. But it happens because it's almost impossible to prove. And fraudulent voting, and this is not new. This is not a Trump versus Biden thing. This has been going on for a long, long time. Is people in nursing homes who are so incompatible, like people with Alzheimer's who can't tell you their own name, have voted. And they've had voted nursing home ballots where all the signatures look the same in the entire nursing home, or half the signatures look the same. And the other is intercepted mail. You get, the mail comes to you, and somebody, Bethany downstairs said, "Here, you fill this out." And I said, "No, I can't fill that out. I'm not, it's your ballot." And she said, "Well, I don't know who to vote for." And I said, "Well, you don't have to vote." So, but there's that opportunity to vote on behalf of other people at the same address. And then there's changes of address. And this happens that people who no longer live there. So this is especially true in college neighborhoods. I used to go door to door in college neighborhoods, and there would be a list of 12 people registered to vote at that address. And I'd get there and knock on the door, and sometimes none of the 12 people lived there, that the people who live there now never registered, or sometimes 2 of them or 4 of them lived there. So they're still registered to vote, and in a fair number of cases, particularly in strange districts, they all voted, even though they don't live there anymore. People have gone to vote in person and have been told that they already voted, and they no, I didn't. And so that's a problem. And then there's the broken chain of custody. You mail something in, they don't record which mailman picked it up at the mailbox, which mailman took it to the post office, which mailman sorted it, which mailman sent it to the county elections office. So there is that broken chain of custody. And then there's the problem of, in this past election, there was a mailman in Erie who testified. He overheard the supervisor tell, and this is a Trump versus Biden thing, I guess, heard the supervisor instruct the guy that they had a bunch of ballots that came in the day after the election, and he said date them for election day, so that they'll be legitimate. And one of the things is that the Postal Service, rightly or wrongly, was under the impression that Trump was going to privatize the post office completely and get rid of the post office. So there was a great deal of animosity or disdain for Trump within the Postal Service. So you have people with a serious interest in getting rid of the getting rid of mail-in ballots for Trump. So those are in general problems with mail-in ballots. And the Pennsylvania courts refused to hear challenges from the Trump administration. But just this year, they ruled that the way we did the election in 2020 was illegal. And so basically ruling says we can't do that anymore. So, but in many states, mail-in voting is still it's, in Oregon and Washington, I believe, mail-in voting is the standard. It might be in California too. And it creates a thing where everybody gets to vote, and it's easier to vote. And the question becomes, should it be easy to vote? Should it be so easy to vote that people who they can't be bothered to go to the polls, where they bother to examine the candidates? So there is that. And one thing that's interesting is that the Australian ballot or the Belgian ballot required the person to be able to read. And so shortly after the Civil War, well, this came in well after the Civil War. This came in, in the 1890s mostly. And a lot of Blacks couldn't read because as they grew up as slaves and there was no opportunity for them to read. So, and this is why literacy tests were a problem, but the pre-printed ballot itself was a problem. And so Black voting went down as they shifted to the Australian ballot. And I don't think there's any racist intent in certainly not on the part of George or the United Labor Party, because the Knights of Labor were adamant that you could not join the Knights of Labor. Your union could not be represented by the Knights of Labor if it did not admit blacks into the union. So, and Terence Powderly, the head of the Knights of Labor, celebrated union locals that had black officers, and he rejected. He said, I'm sorry to somebody in Waco, said, we will never have a union here if we have to admit blacks. And he said, well, you can have a union, but it can't be part of the Knights of Labor. So, they were very progressive with regard to racial questions at that time. But in the South, having a printed ballot wasn't good enough. So they had literacy tests on top of that. And that was undoubtedly serving that purpose. So anyhow, I'm done with the main part of the talk. And I see a couple. I see Joe Polito said Canada got it in 1874. So Canada got it a little sooner than we did, because we didn't even start to get it till 1888. So anyhow, yeah, if you want to, Ibrahim, do you want to manage the question and answer, or do you want me to take that?
I could take care of that. I see that Marty Roland raised his hand. Marty, you have a question? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, and you can put your camera on if you want.
Yeah. Good. Appreciate it. It was a good talk. So there's two things. One was the involvement of the clergy of the Catholic Church that was campaigning against George. So that was probably more significant than other types of interference in the election. But the other one was maybe your comment about was the Associated Press and Western Union of the type of the of interference that we see with Facebook, or was it worse or more, or what?
It's in a way, it's similar to Twitter and Facebook, and in that things that were detrimental to Biden, like Hunter Biden's laptop, got squashed as fake news, and then turned out later to be verified by the FBI as legitimate. So there are those aspects, but I don't know. It's interesting because we have so much media now, and we have they control the main, the media is increasingly partisan because it gets more views. So CNN and MSNBC is decidedly left wing. Fox News is decidedly right wing. The news media that is neutral doesn't seem to get much readership or viewership. So we have a situation that, that's similar to the situation we had in the early days. When you look at the newspapers of early America, there were the Federalist partisan papers, and they were called Republican, but Jackson changed the name to Democrat. The party was the Democratic Republican Party, which is an awfully long name. They were just called the Republicans, and then but the Republicans at that time are the legacy of the Democrats today. And newspapers were horrendously partisan back then. And for a while, in my younger days, and I don't know how far back that goes, the newspapers made a serious effort at being objective and calling out people on both sides. even if they were biased, they didn't try to suppress news because it didn't fit their agenda. So, so that's something, and it's partly because they had something of a monopoly. They had a lot of money. News media had a lot of money. You know, when there were three big networks, and then your local news, there was maybe three stations. So in Pittsburgh, we had an NBC, ABC, and CBS television network. And the local stations, they all ran 11 o'clock news. And the NBC affiliate, I think, improved the quality of news because they ran studio wrestling during the news. So when the CBS and ABC stations were running local news, the NBC station was running studio wrestling, which was, you know, the big stage, semi-fake Bruno Sammartino and all these people. And I thought that improves the quality of news, because the people who want cheap entertainment will go watch studio wrestling. And the people who actually want news will go to the news, and the news media would have to say, okay, we're not going to get the cheap entertainment audience because they're watching the wrestling match. So we will give you the more legitimate news. But what has happened is that they don't have the money to do proper investigation. So they take what's handed to them. And they also find that if you say nice things about the liberals, then the conservatives will turn you off. And if you say nice things about the conservatives, the liberals will turn you off. And so the partisan stations are getting all the viewership again. And so that's basically what's been going on. You're muted, Marty. Okay.
Looks like Wayne has a question. I'm assuming Marty is done.
Yeah, and I see Sue said, what about voter aids with language? You know, that is still done. The candidates and the political parties still hand out, they're called tickets. The ticket used to be the ballot, but they still have a ticket. So they have a slate of candidates. And even if you can't read, if you can hold up your ticket next to the ballot box and you can say, okay, this guy this guy's the one my people endorsed and he's here, you can vote that way. So so if you couldn't read, or you couldn't read English very well, you still had a pretty good shot at candidates. Referendums are a different question, and the ballot, the slate endorsements would often endorse a referendum one way or the other. So it would say vote yes on C16 or something like that. And you'd go to the ballot, and if you could find the C16, you didn't have to be able to read the entire thing. Wayne.
After Wayne's done, can I elaborate on a few other things, but go
Sure.
to Wayne first. Okay.
You're muted, Wayne.
Okay, I'll mute myself again. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Yes, you said earlier about England having parliamentary districts with very few people in it. I think they were generally called rotten boroughs at that time. Rotten boroughs. I must say that the one time in the last 40 years I failed to vote in an election in which I was legally entitled to vote was because I had not arranged for absentee ballot. And on election day, I came down with the flu, and there was no way I could barely get to the bathroom, so I just didn't vote that time. And if we had, had been able to vote, put the ballot in a drop box before the election, I would have. But at that time, that was not an option then. In California, we do have, mail-in voting. I've generally, in the last few elections, I have, in fact, in Sacramento County, we were doing part of a pilot program along with a few other counties, and we were having basically 100% mail-in. And what I generally did was put the ballot in a locked drop box, and nobody could see what I was doing. One innovation from Australia, which you did not mention, and why I might add, I personally am opposed to, is compulsory voting. Australia fines people who, and so does Belgium, I think, and a few other countries. If you fail to vote in election and you're legally entitled to vote, you have to pay a fine. And I might like to. So not all innovations from Australia are necessarily things we should copy. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, and the problem with compulsory voting is that if you can't compel somebody to pay attention to who you're voting for. I mean, it's like, okay, you have to vote, and so what do? You go into the voting booth and you vote for the guy whose name is ethnically like yours, or you vote for stupid reasons because you didn't pay any attention. They can't legally make you pay attention. So there was an old Andy Capp cartoon, and I have been looking for it, and I've never been able to find it. But it was basically he's berating somebody for not voting because it's your sacred duty to go in and vote. And then the next thing you see is the voting booth and the curtain, and you see his feet at the bottom of the curtain, and at the top of the curtain you see a coin flipping. So he's basically flipping a coin to decide who to vote for, and that's the problem with it. People voting. This was in the 70s. I took a political science class, and it was about voter turnout. It was one of the few political science classes that were actually about science, or about the science of politics. And one of the things they had done is they had a study where they gave people fictitious names. There was nobody in that town by those names. And what they found was that they just said, well, you have to vote for somebody, and it's just a test, and you get $5 for having voted, and it's fictitious people for a fictitious office. And what they found was that immigrants of various ethnicities, their first choice, it was a ranked choice thing. So you say, here's Mark, you put a 1 on your first choice and a 2 on your second choice, and so on. Their first choice was their own ethnicity, and their second choice was Irish. And this traces back to the days when the Irish were the only immigrant workers, of all the landless immigrant workers, the Irish understood the English language and the Irish understood English law. So all the other immigrants, the Germans and the Italians and the Poles and the Hungarians and whatever, they relied on the Irish to advise them on all this stuff. And it created a system where city politics particularly became dominated by the Irish. I just think that's interesting. They didn't vote for the English as much as they voted for the Irish, because the English they associated with landlords. That was one of the, and they did studies on, a guy who is a committee man because he has a patronage job, did a poorer job of turning out the votes than the guy who was a committee man because he was interested in the issues or in the party or whatever. So that's Sue, what did you want to say?
Okay, this is a multifaceted question, and you have a background to anybody. I have been an election judge for over 20 years. Okay, what you first described as assisting is I would call a palm card, because literally people would write the names of candidates on their palms. What I meant by voting assistant, it's like the older woman who can barely walk or doesn't understand the English language is accompanied by her aide. So that, and basically
Yeah.
you have election judges, we all knew that the person really voting was the assistant. What do you think of day of registration and the like, when people come in to the polls and register to vote? They produce their proof, which I wonder about. And what do you think about early voting and voting on weekends instead of on Tuesdays?
I don't have any particularly strong reservations about early voting if it's not too early. I mean, a lot of times the vote, there's a lot of people whose votes were already cast and they wish they could change their mind.
Mhm.
So, and voting on weekends seems to make sense. It should not be the only option because Saturday is a religious day to Jewish people, and Sunday is a religious day to most Christians. And you could have a Saturday and a Sunday and a Tuesday,
Mhm.
and do it that way. It should be easier to vote. Pennsylvania, because a voting district in Pennsylvania is usually has a population of 700, which does not even mean 700 voters. So our polls don't crowd up on election day. We don't get long lines very often. But there's places, particularly in the South, where there's not enough voting booths. And so they make up for that by having multiple days for voting. I guess my only reservation for that is that the ballots are sitting somewhere for a longer time. And so you have to have a better system of securing the ballots and making sure nobody is adding or subtracting from the ballots while they are in limbo. Other than that, I mean, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, that's only 4 days, and you should be able to secure the ballots for 4 days. Yeah, I don't see a problem with that. And I do see a problem with you increase the number of people who have to have an absentee ballot. If you can say, well, you don't need an absentee ballot unless you're tied up on all 3 of these. You're tied up Saturday, Sunday. We might as well throw in Monday. You're tied up for all 4 of these days. Well, then you need an absentee ballot, but very few people will be tied up for all 4 of those days. So that still brings up the people under nursing care or whatever. And it brings up the question of, I think somebody's personal attendee is more likely, if the personal attendee is escorting the person into the ballot, I think they're more likely to honestly represent the person they're attending. I'm more concerned with a nursing home that collects hundreds of ballots and votes for the candidate who wants to give increased funding to nursing homes. That's
what do you think of electronic voting? I have seen ultra liberals and ultra conservatives who will not touch a machine. I have seen they much prefer the paper ballot and being able to go into the ballot box, which frankly In Cook County, Illinois, the same key worked all the boxes.
Yeah,
And I also know about ID, having approved picture ID. One lady, I approved her to vote because she had an FOI car, a gun permit to carry a concealed carry. That was that and a Sam's Club. They were both picture IDs. But using a utility, I mean, there is so much fraud. It's unbelievable. And I really don't trust a voting machine because I remember counting a voting that had no internet. I couldn't get out. But my vote, when we went to transmit ballots, we could automatically get through.
Yeah,
so that was
there were problems with the recent things. And Pennsylvania, this past election had switched their voting machines. So now the voting machine scans the paper ballot. So you vote on a paper ballot and then you feed it into the machine and the machine scans it, but the paper ballot is still in the ballot box. So if there's a challenge, you can manually count the paper ballots and see if the machine got it right. There are other voting machines that you vote on the machine and it punches out a paper ballot. And then you get to look at the paper ballot and say, yeah, that's who I voted for, and drop it in the ballot box. So, or it automatically drops it in the ballot box. So there are ways to have the best of both worlds.
But it's a long time coming because these the actual voting machines are quite expensive. So counties can't always get to them. Yeah. So I found your talk very interesting. So
thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about, because some people like, how can you compare Henry George to Donald Trump? And I was thinking, well, they're very different in many ways and very similar in many ways. Henry George was a journalist from the outset. He was very articulate. He was very analytical. His analysis had great depth to it. Donald Trump was a Queens building contractor, and he did his TV personality things. So there's that, but he was primarily a building contractor, and he did things by the seat of his pants. He did things by intuition. He far from being analytically sophisticated, he was glib and gratuitously abrasive, where Henry George was, when you watch Henry George things, he never was name calling. He was well, occasionally, but it was always tied to the issue. Henry George was very focused on principles and issues, and Donald Trump was, I think, he had interesting intuitions, but I don't think he had analytical prowess. And sometimes that worked for him and sometimes it didn't. And the things they had in common is that they had both antagonized all the powers that be in both parties. And Henry George ran as a third party, so that was a different thing. But Trump had antagonized the media. He had antagonized the big tech corporations. He had antagonized the government bureaucracies. He antagonized the Republican elites. So he kind of antagonized all the same people that Henry George antagonized, except that Henry George's antagonisms were extremely well reasoned and well explained, so that anybody who sits down and reads the things that Henry George has written, you know exactly where he stands. But they were both assassinated, character assassinated. And it was easier to assassinate Henry George because there was not much of an alternative media. His papers had very small circulation. And it was easy to assassinate Donald Trump because he just says things that can be taken different ways, and wasn't very good at being totally clear about what he meant. So I don't know that Donald Trump's success would have led to real and lasting reform. So so that's the main thing. I kind of like Donald Trump in some ways and dislike him others, but in terms of real permanent reform, I don't see it. See, Marty has his hand up again.
Oh, good. Yeah, I wanted to get back to the election of 1886. Would you go so far as to say that the impact of the Catholic clergy on the election to be similar to like the mafia, in the sense that if you vote for this communist, you'll go to hell? I mean, that's essentially what the clergy was saying.
It might have had an effect, although Henry George's constituency was almost entirely Catholic in New York. I mean, it's like the Protestants were the landlords and the Catholics were the tenants, and he had overwhelming support and from that. And the Catholic Church didn't go after Father McGlynn till after that election, I think. You know, I remember seeing in the Standard, the first issue of the Standard was about the not the impeachment, the excommunication of Father McGlynn.
Yeah.
And that was, January of 1887. So it was shortly after the election, but I don't remember whether they had executed or excommunicated McGlynn in the midst of that election or not.
They did it afterwards, but what they did do is the Sunday right before the election on Tuesday was announced from the pulpit that they shouldn't be voting for Henry George. That was pretty well documented. So, anyway,
yeah, I'm sure it carries weight because his vote was overwhelmingly the Catholic vote.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Any other? I guess not.
Yep.
Any? Well,
I
I
guess
guess
we can close it for tonight, and we will be meeting again next week.
okay. What is the topic for next week?
Let me pull the website and put it on screen share. All right. So the next one is going to be on 25th, March 25th, same time, 6:30. And it's going to be on communication monopolies, as you just mentioned it, Dan.
Okay.
But we do
And
have other courses. So Mari's class should be ending next Monday, but we have Rethinking Economics with Stephen Taft, which is starting.
okay. And I just put I just put his Henry George's essay on Western Union in the chat.
Okay, yes, I see it.
And I didn't.
Dan, it looks
I
like
don't see.
Tom Rossman has a question.
Ah, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment. Excellent presentation, Dan, as usual. Michael Porter's recent book, The Politics Industry. He's the tenured Harvard professor and probably the world's leading expert on competitiveness, and talking about some of our declining competitiveness problems as a country, but he devotes an entire chapter to how unfair and tilted the electoral system was in the 19th century. And it really it takes your material and gets a lot more detail into some of the specifics. Like, for example, they used to, in some localities, they would have different colored paper, so everyone knew who you're voting for. Some had different ballot boxes, so literally, they would know. And the party, and also he talks extensively about the dominance of the party machines and how the party machines controlled the electoral process in the 19th century. So it's some good background. In fact, William McKinley's campaign advisor said there's two important rules in politics. One is money, and I forget what the other one is. So it's kind of funny. It takes, gives a lot of detail on the history of it and how it evolved, and obviously how great the Australian ballot was, the secret ballot was in helping to change that and defang the party machines. And after it was introduced, the party machines started to decline. But even with that, I was very shocked to learn Tammany Hall actually continued to exist until the 1930s. So even with the secret ballot, there was still a lot of corruption and manipulation in the system.
Yeah, and Tammany Hall existed. Tammany Hall, I think, was started by Aaron Burr. So it was contemporary to Thomas Jefferson. Tammany Hall was very old, and Aaron Burr's contribution to American politics was he built the technology of organized voter solicitation. So Aaron Burr kept cards on all the voters and marked them as to who was leaning in favor of his candidate. Aaron Burr pioneered the getting out the vote mechanisms. So and then he shot Alexander Hamilton, but I still don't like him. So
yes, so other upcoming seminars, there is another one on Henry George and the Chinese question. That's going to be scheduled for April the 1st. And we have marginal land, marginal labor, and marginal capital. So that's going to be the week after, I believe. That's going to be 2 weeks after. So the next one we've done is going to be the one on media monopolies.
yeah, and that's the one I just put the link for.
Exactly.
And
so,
I apparently haven't uploaded the one on the secret ballot. Henry George wrote an essay on the secret ballot as well.
yeah, if you
And
could send it
it's
to
called,
me, if you could send me the link, I would be able to distribute it to the platform. So everyone who attended, at least anyone who registered, could get it.
oh, okay. There. I think I have it right here. Nope.